I have been filming with the Pocket 6K Pro and all of the various tools that you can get for the camera over the last week, and I think I'm in a good position to give you guys my hands-on impression of the camera. As always, I will have a more in-depth and longer written review on the PremiumBeat blog. But yeah, let's talk about the 6K Pro. First, the image quality, or perhaps to not talk about the image quality more specifically, because if you wanted to know what footage looks like from the Pocket 6K Pro, you can simply search for some 6K footage, as it's the exact same sensor. There's no image advancements or anything like that. It does ship with the Gen 5 color science that you can find in the 12K, but the Pocket 4K and the Pocket 6K are going to be receiving the Gen 5 color science in a firmware update in the coming weeks. So it's not as if you're at some disadvantage if you're sticking with the 6K. So instead, let's talk about what really excels this camera outside of the standard 6K, and it's the hardware, the things around the camera itself. The first thing, we can get rid of these. No need for variable NDs. The camera has built-in ND filters. Now, if you guys had caught my previous video on buying an older DSLR, in that I discussed that I had recently invested into a cinema camera, a C300 Mark III, and one of the assets that I wanted my next investment to be was built-in NDs. I have a lot of different lenses, vintage and modern, with various filter sizes. So I've got tons of step-up rings, a few different variable ND filters. And while it's not the end of the world to swap and take them off and so forth, it does get tedious when you're doing it non-stop throughout the day. So having built-in NDs opens up a lot more doors. So you can have different filters attached to the front of the lens, Pro Mist, polarizer, wherever that may be. Likewise, variable NDs are prone to ghosting and flaring because they've got the two filters stacked on top of each other. So the 6K Pro completely nullifies that if you've been using variable NDs with the 6K. So there's up to 6 stops of filtration in the Pro, and they increase in 2-stop variables. These are controlled with the 2 buttons on the back of the camera, and these filters, they do stack, so you couldn't rack exposure because you would see the filters slot into space as you're doing that. But it's such a useful feature, guys. For myself, I would say it's perhaps worth the extra £500 that the 6K Pro costs over the 6K by itself. But while we're talking about new features on the back of the camera, let's talk about the tilt screen, which has seemingly put a halt to all third-party productions of external tilt screens. A long requested feature, and Blackmagic has finally delivered, and on this tilt screen, you can tilt both upward if you're shooting at hip height, or downward if the camera is a little bit higher. And I had a comment on my Pocket 4K cinema video earlier this week, actually, and the commenter was disgruntled that Blackmagic had decided not to include a 180-degree flip screen for vlogging. Now, it's a cinema camera. It's a cinema camera in title. It's a cinema camera by nature. There's not even any in-body stabilization or autofocus. So even if you are vlogging on this camera, I'm sure the footage isn't going to be that great. So there's no need for a flip screen. The tilt screen is a great addition, as is. But in fact, what I would consider a better improvement than the tilt screen itself is that it's a brand new screen. It's a HDR LCD, 1500 nits of brightness. Guys, it is incredibly bright, especially when you up the brightness in the settings menu as well. In this shot in particular, it's a bright sunny day. It's midday, so the sun is highest and brightest in sky. I'm out in the open field, there's no shade coverage, and I could see all the information on the LCD screen as clear as day. That was a little bit of a pun. But yeah, I think I would rank the visibility of the LCD screen, of the HDR LCD screen, higher than the fact that it tilts out. But on the topic of talking about how this camera increases efficiency of monitoring, a new addition for the Pocket line is the Pro EVF. Now, this is a separate purchase. It's not adaptable to the 4K and 6K, only the 6K Pro at the moment. I have not used it. I do not know when I would use it. The LCD screen is more than compatible for most circumstances for when I would think I would need to use an EVF. You know, it's great. It does its job. It's really well built as typical Blackmagic standards. But I just don't need it. especially because it's placed in like a DSLR style EVF, you know, with a cinema camera. When you've got the EVF coming out and protruding upwards, you know, if the camera's at waist height or something and you just crouch down a little bit to look into the EVF, that makes sense. But if this is at waist height and you're kind of getting down to look into it, that's what the tilt screen is there for. Perhaps it's just my style of shooting, but it's just not for me. For the PremiumBeat review, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the EVF. And perhaps later into the week, I'm just going to go out for a few shoots and just solely use this so I can get to grips with it. At the moment, I don't find it useful. But on the topic of new additions to the camera as well, we are saying goodbye to the Canon LP-E6 battery and instead are using the Sony NP LF570. I think that's it. Do you know what, guys? I'm just going to say Canon and Sony because all these numbers always mix me up. We all know that the Pocket 4K and the Pocket 6K, 8 batteries like no tomorrow. I think it was like 40 to 50 minutes on a good day. Now, is the Sony batteries better than the Canon LP-E6? Yes. Significantly better? Not so much. I went out for a shoot and on my metadata, I started recording at 14:18, so near enough 20 past 2, and the final shot in which the battery died was at 15:38, so near enough 90 minutes or so. And at this time, I had the camera on quite consistently. I only turned it off here and there, and I was filming in slow motion. I'm not too sure if that drains power more proficiently. But yeah, so you're looking at 90 to maybe 100 minutes. So double, I guess, in some circumstances. But it wasn't a case of, you know, if I charge the battery I have for the C300 Mark III, it's a case I'll be out shooting all day with it, and I get home and it's kind of a case of it's at 50%. With the new Sony batteries, it was noticeable that I was losing power quickly throughout those 90 minutes. But like the 4K and the 6K, there is now a battery grip for the 6K Pro. It is another additional purchase. It doesn't come with the camera. And likewise, the extra batteries do not also come with the grip. So there's 2 additional purchases on top of that. However, you can hot swap the batteries. So while a normal battery grip requires you to insert it into the camera in the place of the battery in the camera, now you can have all 3 batteries active. And if you need to swap any out, obviously by the one in the camera itself, you can do so and keep the camera on. That's incredibly useful. And oh, hey, while we're here, I'm a little bit of a battery grip enthusiast. I love buying battery grips for all my cameras. I've had them for years. These, you know, it doesn't matter what brand you're using, they're always plasticky and they're always really fickle. You don't want to drop them. They probably will break. It's not a Blackmagic thing. It's every single battery grip on the market. The sled is always plasticky and fickle. Don't drop it. Now, I recently produced a tutorial for Shutterstock Tutorials on using the pros and cons of recording to a field recorder and recording audio to a camera. And in that, I said, however, that sound file is only ever likely to have one audio track, as most consumer cameras will only have the one mic input. Now on the 6K Pro, we've got 2 XLR inputs, and that's going to be incredibly useful if you've previously been recording to an external recorder because you needed those extra inputs. Now you have that with the 6K Pro. Overall, that's essentially what we've got for the 6K Pro. It's not a new line of pocket cameras. It's not a new, it's not the next generation. It's slightly improved hardware. And when I say slightly, that's also reflected in the price too. It's only a slight increase, £500 here and there. So you're going to have to offset that £500 to the 6K model. So do you need to invest into an external monitor? Because you find that when you're out shooting, the 6K screen, you can't see the details all properly, and you're always covering your eyes, covering the LCD screen. Are you buying a lot of batteries because the LP-E6 batteries die like that? And are you using a field recorder? For me specifically, are you always swapping out your variable NDs? If these are all detriments to your shooting style, then yes, get the 6K Pro. If you have a Pocket 6K and you have all those external components and it's not a detriment to your workflow, there's not necessarily a great need to upgrade to the 6K Pro. It does ship with Gen 5 color science, but you guys are going to be getting that too in a few weeks with the firmware. So there's not as if there's a discrepancy in the image quality between the two cameras. Now, as I stated earlier, I will have a longer, more in-depth review with the camera, and I will have my typical cine vid coming out shortly. That's been some great fun to shoot. Overall, the best pocket cinema camera on the market for sure, but that doesn't negate the image quality of the 4K and the 6K. It's just that this increases the efficiency of shooting. So I've been Lewis, I'll catch you guys again.